the violent and out of control nature of the schools in which he was being raised, at least educationally speaking, a number of people were saying that's not some outlier. That is a normal public school.
And the same is true of the internet. There's stuff that's out there that is far beyond their cognitive capacity and emotional maturity to be able to process and deal with. There's this discussion already about their sexual prowess and preferences, and very sexually focused conversations seem to be happening amongst these young people.
When a teacher just comes in and says, I am a, whatever, and they start opening the door to this, it's being done not in those dark corners of the internet, but in school.
Hello, and welcome to Awake at the Wheel. So, in previous episodes, we've discussed a lot about men and men's mental health, but the source of this is, of course, boys. Men are boys at some point. So, there is a TV series that recently came out on Netflix. But to introduce the topic today and the episode today, we're going to start out by just watching a video.
This video is for parents and people who care about what's happening with their youth. If that's not you, feel free to scroll. Make time this weekend to watch Netflix new show, Adolescence. The show is tough to watch, but it's also impossible to ignore because it's not just another drama, it's a wake-up call. More and more boys are being influenced by toxic masculinity influencers on social media that are shaping their views very dangerously. And what used to seem like random cases is now mainstream. Perfect example is this man right here. If you don't know who he is, Google him. Just last week, Kyle Clifford murdered his ex-partner, her sister, and her mother, and said that he was influenced by Andrew Tate. And if you think he's not influencing your kids, just know that Andrew ranks as one of the top social media influencers for boys as young as 13 and as old as 65. Anyways, watch the show if you want to understand how social media is shaping our kids and influencing the way they view women and the way they view the world. The show was masterfully done and has a 98% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Watch it and then come back here and let me know what you think.
Okay, so of course, we watch the show. There's a lot of overlapping themes that she mentioned there that are certainly relevant to the discussions that we have. So, of course, I want to start out by just kind of criticizing her take on it to begin with. So, I suppose before we jump in, spoiler alert to anybody who hasn't watched the TV series, we're going to get into some of the details of it and some of the themes. So, if you want to watch the series first, certainly do so. But be aware we're going to maybe spoil the ending for you. So, nonetheless, I think that she, in my opinion, frames this show as presenting the norm of what's going on out there with teens. So, I certainly think that some of the themes that are in the show, such as bullying and harassment and interpersonal challenges and family challenges and all of those things that teens deal with, absolutely. But I almost get the sense that she thinks that these extreme outcomes seem to be the increasing norm, and I just don't know if that's the case. So my first thought is there's some dangerous framing around it. What do you think, Oren?
Well, now I want to be careful here. I don't want to go into a rant, but I know before I even saw the show, I was seeing popping up on my feed people complaining about the, let's say, directorial choices made. Now, the director or the writer, who also plays the boy's father, I'm blanking on his name, a wonderful actor. I remember seeing him in Snatch many years ago, and I think Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels before that, many, many years ago. Wonderful, intense actor, which I should remember his name. I think it's Steven something. So people are saying that what I'm about to say is simply a reflection of the fact that since he wanted to be in his own show, if he's going to choose his son, if that's the role he's playing, the father, then the boy is going to be white. And others are, so they're saying that's all that there is. There's nothing beyond that. Whereas other people are saying the knife crime that is committed here. We're talking about young girls getting stabbed, and they're making it look like this is an increasing trend. Well, again, I don't want to get too much into the politics here, but there are very few stories of white girls being stabbed by white boys, not adults, but boys. But where there are young men or adolescents or boys stabbing girls, they are not usually white. And that's what people are complaining about, saying that framing. So if you want to talk about framing, so people are saying, of course, it has to be the white male, nobody else. Yes, there's a,
Mhm.
there are some black kids in the show, and I think some brown as well, but they get, they're not the main characters. It's this white boy. So a lot of people are seeing this as yet another attack on white males. So I just want to put that out there as a framing. Again, I don't know if it was deliberate or if they were trying to avoid controversy, but that's one of the framings. And the second one, as far as these outcomes, yeah, violence is getting worse for sure. Once again, the violence, who's the perpetrator, who's the victim, that may not have been necessarily accurately reflected in the program when you think about the numbers. But there is, I was watching other people's commentary on this, people from the UK, and several people were saying that the schools, so it's not just this horrific act that's committed where this boy murders this girl, but the violent and out of control nature of the schools in which he was being raised, at least educationally speaking. A number of people were saying that's not some outlier. That is a normal public school. So I think there are some, whether we put aside the politics, whether we put aside some of the, let's say, questionable framing in the show and the commentary, the fact is, I think it does touch upon some factors that I think people should pay attention to. And of course, the harmful influence of social media and influencers like Andrew Tate cannot be ignored. But when you blow it up the way that they do, that's going to cause a number of people to just tune out.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges too is I'm sure a lot of parents are scared watching this because the portrayal, at least I think in the first episode, is like this Jamie kid was such a good boy and all of a sudden he went bad. And I think that's really problematic because the reality is, as we know, when we're looking at situations from a psychological and sociological perspective, there are the collection of risk versus protective factors. Um, One of the challenges that I had with watching this was there wasn't a whole lot that was provided about his history, and that's just, my need to know these things to kind of make sense of, what happened and so on, but I don't think they told us too much about, like, what life was like before all of this happened, but nonetheless, I did wanna go through a list that I've kinda compiled here in watching it about what the risk factors were, what the protective factors were. I think there were far more risk factors than protective factors, which is problematic. But my point in doing this is I want parents to understand that it isn't just a light switch that all of a sudden your good little boy is going to go bad and go and murder somebody.
Right.
I think there was a little bit of course, it's a TV show, so there is some dramatization of it and hyperbole and so on and so forth. But real life isn't that black and white.
Right. Okay. Well, why don't we go through the list and comment
Yeah.
on?
Okay. Absolutely. So first off, and I have like a cluster of different things. Like I kind of went nuts writing this out because it just kept flowing as I was thinking about it. But I think one of the biggest problems that arose for this kid is that he had unsupervised, unrestricted access to the internet. So we've spoken about this in other episodes before as well, and essentially, like, no, never. This should not be the case. I don't care, what the rationale is. Kids are not equipped to be able to have completely unrestricted access to the internet. There is so much stuff out there. And an analogy that I often use is you wouldn't send your kid out into the woods without any proper training, equipment, resources, tools. And the same is true of the internet. There is stuff that's out there that is far beyond their cognitive capacity and emotional maturity to be able to process and deal with. And the insinuation throughout the show is that this kid was accessing such content. So I know that it's, no longer the 90s, and it's not like when I was growing up and the computer was in a centralized place
Right.
in the home where everybody saw what was going on. But I do think that some version of that is possible even nowadays. For example, no computer usage with the door closed. And not to say that one should be spying on their kid at all times and watching what they're doing at all times, but I think the understanding of, mom and dad or mom or dad or whoever supervising the kid can hear what's going on and can be aware of what's going on is something that could be a protective factor, as opposed to having that completely unrestricted free access and full privacy too.
Hmm. Right. And it's difficult because if the kid has a phone, they can find that privacy. So, and they're not in the house a lot of the time. So there are many opportunities for the child to have, unfettered access to these, social media and the internet. But, the parents have to try. You can't just throw up your hand and say, well, what can we do? Right. And we've talked before about this, having discussions with them, finding out what they're into and so on. And, it's not, doesn't mean that they're going to be honest with you, but just giving up and abdicating your responsibility is obviously not the right path.
Absolutely. And I think that leads into the next factor that I have noted here is the fact that this kid was clearly accessing content that was portraying negative portrayals of masculinity and so on. And again, no, we can't protect our kids from everything that's out there on the internet. But it is on us as parents to ensure that we're having regular discussions about, what they're watching, what they're seeing, and helping them to critically process what they're seeing and not just take it at face value.
Right. I think that's really important that the parents, once again, even, and it's not about parents lecturing the kids. It's not about parents saying, oh my God, that Andrew Tate's a monster or whatever, because the kid's just going to say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. This is like every generation in history, has always thought their parents are out of touch and don't know. So it's asking questions, having a discussion, even if you don't like it. It's, again, hearing what your kids are thinking about this. So it's, what are they accessing? What are they thinking about it? What are they doing about it? And, you don't have that, you don't get that information if you're just lecturing the child.
Exactly. Another thing that was, I don't think focused on too much in the show, but was certainly highlighted at some points was that this kid apparently had low self esteem and limited interests. So this can be a risk factor, certainly, because, if he's not feeling great about himself or a kid's not feeling great about oneself, they're potentially going to seek out things that either I think support the narrative that might be in their mind or bolster their confidence in perhaps negative ways. For example, I think they mentioned that this kid was interested in art, and there weren't really opportunities for him to bolster his self confidence through mastery in something that he's very good at. So, something that parents can do in situations like this are paying attention to what your kid is into, what they're really good at, and helping them to master those skills, which in turn can help to bolster their self confidence.
Right, and conversely, there was a bit of mention of about the fact that his father, you can see, he's in shape, he's a manly man, and he tried to get him into sports, and and it was clear that even the father was embarrassed. I think both the father and the son mentioned it to the psychologist, and the father mentioned it to his wife afterwards about, like, I couldn't even look at him, or all the other parents were laughing at him when he was in goal, I believe. So, and that's something that a lot of parents have to be careful about, because I've worked with a number of parents who are trying to get their children into activities that they think will make them, popular or give them confidence. And I say, well, okay, great, but be prepared for the fact that it might not be their aptitude. And if you put them in with a bunch of kids, especially as they're getting older, 5 or 6 years old, let's say with sports, kids are all pretty not great. There might be one or two superstars. 8 to 10, now the skills are differentiating, especially 12 to 14. Now you really see it. So if you put a child in with a bunch of kids, again, I'm thinking sports because that's the number one thing that people think with their boys. It really may not be what they're into. So, and the show, again, they kind of hinted at it, that he had this more artistic side. So they could have, and I think they even mentioned, I can't remember if in the last episode, that both of the parents were sort of, lamenting the fact that they didn't, again, sort of foment that talent more.
Mhm.
So anyway, so it's important to know what they, potential that they can do, and also be prepared that it could blow up in your face. And kids are really, really mean. Even if your kid's pretty good at chess, send them to a chess club. Well, you never know how nasty and the other chess players can be, and make them feel like crap. So again, having discussions with them about their experiences, again, whether it's online, virtually, or whether it's with other peers, and seeing whether this really is the thing for them, and not just thinking whether because it's your interests or because you think this is the right thing, pushing them in a direction that's not good for them, or sorry, that they're not going to really flourish in, could backfire.
And I think to add to that too, especially starting from a young age, perhaps even having shared interests with your child and doing an activity together, building that skill together, that's not only going to help with their self confidence and mastery, as I mentioned, but also helping to further foster that connection between you and your child and ensuring that you have kind of built in space where you can talk and explore what's going on. So I think that's a good strategy that could assist with that. Um, But tying into what you were saying earlier, I think another risk factor that this child, Jamie, had was a limited peer circle. It seems like he had a few friends, but it also seemed like he maybe was in a bit of an echo chamber. So, friends with maybe similar challenges that he was experiencing. Um, and another thing, this is maybe tangential, but I think ties into the peer circle challenge, is that it seems like at the age of 13, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this differs quite a bit from when we were younger, there's this discussion already about their sexual prowess and, preferences and, very sexually focused conversations seem to be happening amongst these young people, and developmentally speaking, that seems quite young.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's younger than it was before by, let's say, a couple of years. Ironically, in the last few major surveys, children are actually waiting later to actually to have sexual intercourse. They may
Mhm.
do other sexual acts. And we know, I don't want to get too graphic, but we know that, let's say, oral sex has become something that once was very taboo, even among adults. Now it's the go to. It's become so
Mhm.
minimized and everything like that. But having, actual sexual intercourse, it's later, it's with fewer partners than before. But the talk about it, the implication that everybody's doing it has only got much worse, and it does start younger. And you're right, people don't have the capacity. Now, by the way, I'll tell you right now, I put some of that blame, not all, but some of that on teachers because there's been such a push. Because of the gender madness, the gender ideology craze, that teachers will come in and they will say, "I am," and they're telling
Mhm.
the kids what they identify as. And I've got parents telling me, my kid is like 6 years old, they're 8 years old. They're saying, "I am an asexual, blah, blah, blah," or "I am a pansexual," because kids are hearing these words. And it's not just on
Yeah.
social media, it's in the classrooms. So again, I really want to lay a lot of the blame, not all, but a lot of it on
Mhm.
quote unquote educators, especially the ones who are so narcissistic that they believe that they should be, sort of imposing their own lifestyles on the kids. And everyone who knows me knows I am very, very liberal and open minded. I believe in proper, comprehensive sexual education or sex education. And I think, but it has to be age appropriate. So, again, when a teacher just comes in and says, "I am a, whatever," and they start opening the door to this, it's being done not in those dark corners of the internet, but in school. So kids are being taught, oh, this is something that we should be talking about. This is something we should know about. This is something, that we should be exposed to. And again, the kids are just learning this language and it's just normalizing it at such a young age. It's habituating them to these concepts that they're not ready for. So, and again, it just makes it look like everyone's talking about it, everyone's doing it. I should be doing it
Mhm.
too. And the kids are really not equipped, especially at 8, 10, 12, 13.
I didn't even consider that as but yeah, that makes complete sense, but I wonder at what point, because you said it's being habituated and it's become normalized at too young of an age, but then it even seems to, like the example of the show, be then weaponized. So it's interesting how I think, like we always talk about good intentions executed poorly, I'm sure the schools were well-intentioned in presenting this. Obviously, it's not age appropriate, but where do you think it kinda gets twisted and weaponized amongst these young people then?
Well, you give them anything that's taboo, that's different, even though it's being normalized. Certain aspects of it are still, let's say, whether it's taboo or they just know that it's something. Like, for example, I'm just trying to think. I don't want to use the wrong language, but let's say any kids can use anything as a weapon, right? Anything. So if you get something like this, which again, even if it's being normalized, they still know it's something that's it's there's something different about it. So I won't even say taboo. It's exotic in some way. So kids will take they will use that and twist it, and especially if and they go on social media and they learn, oh, I don't even have to weaponize it myself. They're being taught what is the greatest weapon. And in the program, they made it exceedingly clear that being called an incel, which that term was not used, that was not well known until, I don't want to get the year wrong, but it was in Toronto, where this person who was a self-identified incel, horrifically and evilly, ran down a number of people up at in the north end of Toronto in his
Mhm.
van, and that was the first time it was being really, articulated in the public. People saying incel, incel, incel. I want to say it was 8 years ago, between 6 and 8 years ago. I should know that. And I talked about it a lot at the time. And at the same time, it wasn't just him, but he was referring to, again, another incel in the States who everyone, like, that was his hero basically, because he had gone out and he had shot a number of women. And if I'm not mistaken, that particular person also shot a number of men, but that didn't get much of the talk. But the point is, suddenly, incel, yeah, we're talking a very new term, was in the vernacular, and it was and these people, these incels, were portrayed in a certain way. So from the very beginning, these let's say off-putting, socially awkward, can't get a woman, very rueful and jealous and upset at the guys who are successful, and and hateful toward the women who spurn them, and so on. So from the very beginning, it became a very potent insult. And so, and again, the program makes it very clear that there's almost nothing worse that you can be called than an incel.
Yeah. Yeah. So additional risk factors, I think, come from the family situation. And generally speaking, they seem to be, I think, a typical family. But if you dig a little bit deeper, I do think that there are some problematic things that could serve as risk factors. So the first one I'm going to say here, I think, is controversial. But we know that the data supports this, unfortunately. So they appeared to, at least the way they were portrayed, was to be, I think, a lower income, lower socioeconomic status family. Am I saying that people who don't have money are murderers? No. I want to be very clear about that. But there are factors that come along with socioeconomic status that can impact the way that a child perceives the world around them, the way that they interact with the world around them, and so on. In this particular situation, I think some of the challenges could arise from if there are financial stressors in the household that can cause tension and problematic exchanges and just general stress in the household. Let's use his art as an example. Perhaps they didn't have the finances to put him into an art class or help him to buy art supplies that would enhance his skills. Um, Things such as that do play a role. And like I said, I know that that's controversial, but I do think that in this particular situation, that potentially could have been a risk factor.
It could have, and also just more directly, when it comes to his status with his peers. If you don't have the money, you
Mm,
can't buy the newest shoes or
yeah.
whatever is trendy, and that puts him more on the margins, more a potential target for bullying and so on. So yes, and of course, people who are bullied and are marginalized in that way, that's a huge risk factor. So it can be an indirect cause, a direct cause. So, but for sure, and again, and I think people should know we're not making any negative comments about people's socioeconomic status, because we can also find many people who come from privilege. That's a
Yeah.
huge risk factor as well, because they don't learn consequence and the parents bail
Hmm.
them out and they think they can get away with doing anything. So it's just, once again, we're not stigmatizing anybody.
Yeah. And I think it ties into that as well. Is it appeared that the father worked very long hours. So in working those longer hours, he wasn't as physically present and therefore not as emotionally present as would be ideal. So I think that ties into it as well. There's also insinuation in the show of like a poor or absent or dysfunctional communication in the family. It doesn't sound like they were the most psychologically competent or emotionally aware family in the discussions. I think that kind of came out in the last episode where they, said that they could have done more, they could have said more, they could have talked more, so on and so forth. So I think that the family dynamic doesn't appear to be one that is open about communication and discussion, specifically surrounding emotions.
And I mean, if that's the case, it would be, I think, on the milder form, because they did talk, they did joke around, they did go out and
Yeah,
everything, right? So it's not like, I want to be very clear here. I don't want people thinking, oh, we're looking at this family going, oh my God, they were a huge
no,
respect. No, it was on
yeah,
the margins, so to speak. It was. I don't think it was that bad.
hmm,
So we're just saying that, but that, again, it's a show, and you only have 4 episodes to try to flesh all this out. So or flesh this out. So they're hinting at certain things. Um,
yeah,
so,
yeah.
and one of the, if I can just say, I mean, one of the limitations, which was also kind of the fascinating thing about it, I have to say, it's incredible to have shot each episode in one take. And apparently they did every one of those episodes, I think, like
Really?
They shot it every time 10 times, I think 10 or 12 to do it. So that
Yeah.
to me just blew my mind because I've seen this with other movies or shows where they'll do a 7 or a 10-minute take, and that's incredibly difficult. And other times they do it with so it looks like it's a full a straight take, but in fact they cut it here or there. In this case,
Mhm.
that's a big selling point that one take for everything. So on the
Yeah.
one hand, amazing, just amazing cinematography. On the other hand, by doing it that way, you prevent the ability to sort of to input certain cues other that where you could have sort of elaborated on certain things. There could have been flashbacks instead of just sort of hinting at or talking about. They could have
Mhm.
shown scenes that would have given us a broader picture on on the factors that could have led up to this situation, because a lot of people were left, and again I was watching a lot of commentary, a lot of people were left saying, you know what, it just doesn't really, it doesn't all add up.
Yeah.
Right? Because either you say, oh my God, kids on the internet, they're watching Andrew Tate, they're going to become murderers, or you say, come on,
Yeah.
there are 20 steps in between. What were
Yeah.
they? Let us understand that. So,
Yeah.
that's, I think, a limitation.
Agreed. Yeah, and I think the acting was, like, amazing. I will agree with that completely, and, yeah, to that point, I am speculating a bit with some of these, risk factors that I'm pointing out here simply because the gaps were not filled in.
Right.
But again, I imagine that some parents are kind of taking that, catastrophic approach of like, "Oh my gosh, my kid's on the internet too. Are they gonna become a murderer?" So, my hope here is to illustrate that there are so many factors that can lead to that type of behavior. Um, so, on that note, though, in my preparation for this episode and creating the list of risk factors and protective factors, I kind of came up short as far as protective factors, not to suggest that there were none. And what I mean by protective factors for our listeners are things that can buffer a child against, negative outcomes, even if they are exposed to these negative things. Um, one positive protective factor that I identified was that the family does seem to be, and the parents specifically, caring, nurturing, lots of love. They seemed like very well intentioned, loving parents. But what I'll say about love, and I don't know if this is controversial or popular opinion or whatever the case may be, but I think that when parents think of love, they think of allowing their kids to do whatever they want. And I think that there's an absence of love in this situation insofar as giving him that unrestricted access to the internet and not being aware of what he was doing. Part of loving a child is setting clear boundaries and expectations and restrictions and expectations of how they should be behaving. So while I think the family was very loving, I think love was absent in that respect.
Yeah, and I remember my mentor years ago. He was saying, you remember that old Beatles song, "All You Need Is Love," because we were doing parenting capacity assessments, and he said, "No, all you need is structure." Right.
Mhm.
So, because the kids need to internalize that. Obviously, need love as well, but as you say, love is not parenting by guilt. Is not parenting by just letting the kid do whatever you want. It's being able to foster the kind of relationship that enables you to, in not in a non-authoritarian way, but authoritative way, saying, "Here's the proper conduct. Here's what's expected of you," and and that is part of love. And you're right. A lot of parents, especially today, I mean, they throw up their hands, and say, "What can I do?" And they, as I said earlier, they've kind of given up on their responsibilities of oversight and guidance, and in helping the child internalize structure.
Yeah. And the only other protective factor I came up with, and it ties right into that, is he came from an intact family.
Yep.
And this is something that we often consider in our profession of a protective factor simply because when there are two parents in the household, there's a higher likelihood of having more support, more structure, more boundaries, guidelines, and so on and so forth. So we're not suggesting here, and I'm not suggesting here, that a single parent family is going to necessitate poor outcomes. But we do know from the data that being in an intact two parent household is a protective factor.
Yeah, and just one thing, I don't want to go off on a rant here, but because people are so, let's say, self-focused, let's say insecure, that when you say something like that, the statistics are undeniable Yes, but the problem is when people say, "Well, I know lots of people where there was a mother and father, and it was horrible, and it was this and that." Yes, there are many cases like that, but people have to step outside of their own experience, trying to defend their choices or their circumstances, and just look at the data. And now data can be manipulated, but sometimes when the data are so strong, and this is something that has been shown in almost every metric of well-being, which is having an intact family will, not for everybody, but statistically speaking, will lead to better outcomes. It's a huge protective factor, and it also minimize or say, let's say, reduces somewhat, sometimes largely, the many of the risk factors that we talked about. So people shouldn't get so defensive. They should step back and say, okay, what is in the best interest of the children? What is in the best interest of society? And again, I'm not. I don't want to be labeled as someone who's trying to promulgate some old-fashioned 1950s. Okay, we're just saying, look at the stats. There's a reason for this, and if anyway, I want people to get out of their own experiences, put down the defensiveness, and let's just try to look at the facts and see what's again in everyone's best interests.
Yeah. So those two aside, are there any other protective factors that you identified in watching this series?
Um, in the series, no. I was thinking more about the risk factors
Mhm.
because it was the absence of protective factors. For example, once again,
Yeah.
getting back to the school, having teachers who take an interest in kids who. And I've got, I think we've talked before. We have a number of patients who are amazing teachers who
Mhm.
spend the time after school, who do these programs, whether it's, sports or drama or something like that, and they take an active interest. They make the child feel that they're valuable, they're worthy. They help them to flourish and then to grow in as we talked about with these special talents or abilities and so on. So it was the absence of the protective factors that was sort of stood out. And the school, I mean, the program made it really clear these teachers are burnt out. They're apathetic. What can they do? The kids are out of control. And like I said, when I was watching other people talk about, UK schools, they said this was not an anomaly. This was not hyperbolic. This was the state in many
Mm.
different public schools. So that's, there was a huge absence of that protective factor.
Yeah, and I guess that school environment to me, I thought was hyperbolic, and I don't think it's like that over here in Canada, but I certainly could be wrong. I recognize that I live in my little bubble here as far as the clients that I work with and even the neighborhood that I live in. There's problems, but it's not to that degree. But do you know, like, how different it is, Canada versus the UK, in terms of our public schools?
Well, it really depends on which region you're talking about. I
Yeah.
can say in Toronto that I've got many parents and teachers who say that it would be as bad as that. Okay, now maybe not on the grand scale. It might not be all the teachers, and we only saw a few of the teachers. Maybe there were other teachers that weren't so burnt out. They're obviously trying to make a point. Okay, but but teachers not giving a crap, having burnt out, not trying to have a positive influence, kids being able to rule the roost. That's that I've heard so many stories about that. So, and I've even with my own kids to some degree, not nearly as bad. I've got them in good schools, at public schools, but I've always had, I've wanted them to be in a healthy environment in that regard because I knew how important it was, and I was very, very active. And I will say, we've talked about this before, but it's worth mentioning. It's not only the school or the schools; it's not only the people above them, the trustees, the directors, and so on, who are making the education system let's say a shambles, but it's also the teachers the parents. The parents who don't take responsibility for their children, who don't play an active role, and who don't try to see, is my child contributing to a healthy environment, or are they disrupting? I mean, when I go to my youngest one's parent teacher nights, I always ask them, I say, how is she in class? I mean, I can see how she's doing the grades. I can see if she's doing her homework, but I want to make sure that she's one of those people who's actually contributing to a healthy environment. All right. Now, I'm hypocritical because as a kid myself, I was well known as being the class clown. And beyond that, okay, I was the disruptive force, but I wasn't anything like with these kids. It wasn't violence. It was just,
Yeah.
tomfoolery, as we would say. But in any event, parents really, we've talked about it before, but I'll say it one more time. I hate to belabor the point, but parents have to be more active, and they can't. So many parents are just throwing up their hands saying, what can I do? Or equally bad, they're so wrapped up in their own lives, whether it's work, whether it's, the social lives, that so many parents are not as engaged as they should be.
And I get it, parents are working, parents are busy, and, that does make it difficult, but there's only a limited window within which we can ensure that we're doing the absolute best that we can and setting our kids up for success. So while it's difficult, we can do difficult things, and it's imperative to ensure that you're as involved as possible. And I think there's a balance between being involved and smothering, but I think being acutely aware of what your child is into and engaging in, who they're friends with, what they do for fun, what they do outside of school, be very aware. And it's funny because I hesitate to say this, but I almost think that, like, the Indian mom way of being is actually pretty good. As much as I probably didn't like it as a kid, my mom knew everything I was doing. My mom knew who I was friends with, all the things that I just mentioned, and I think it did help keep me on track.
Right. And there has to be a happy medium. We can't have
Sure,
helicopter parents. We can't, right?
of
Can't encroach
course.
on the kids' boundaries. Okay. And just one more thing before I forget, because I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. If we're looking at, since this two things that I think were touched upon, but not enough. Okay. Which is, if you look at the school environment, the fact is, I'll speak about Canada, and I know it's the same in the States, that many of the teachers, a large majority in many cases, are females. We're trying to teach boys
Mhm.
through a female lens, right? We're trying to feminize boys, or we're not allowing boys to be, masculine
Yep.
in healthy ways, right? And so they're finding out about masculinity through maybe unhealthy influences, like and that's the toxic masculinity. And that term was used, I believe, in the series, right? I'd be surprised if it wasn't. And you and I have talked about this, the difference between toxic masculinity and healthy or traditional masculinity. And unfortunately, when you have a bunch of women who are the teachers, I'm not saying all women, but when they are the teachers, when they are the principals, when they are the trustees and so on, they really don't know what they're talking about much of the time. And so maybe they have good intentions, but they are really executing them poorly, and they're doing a terrible job. So that's number one. And then number two, once again, the show touched upon it, but not nearly enough, which is, what about toxic femininity? What about,
Mhm.
that the girl, and let's be clear here. All right. I hate to have to lay out these caveats every time, but we're not saying this girl deserved to be murdered for bullying
Of
this
course
boy.
not.
Right.
No.
Obviously not. However, let's look at the role of female influencers, female peers. Okay, what message? There is a lot of toxic femininity, being promulgated all over the place, and that doesn't get talked about enough. And it's not a zero sum game. It's not who's worse. It's just saying, let's say that there are negative or unhealthy influences out there, on the male side, on the female side, on any side. Let's take a look at that. And, I can, that applies to every type of group you can imagine. And when you shine the flashlight only, or the spotlight only on one group, it gives a distorted image. And so some people will just tune out automatically. Go, well, why did you pay, you give such short shrift to these other factors? So they don't give credence to the good points in adolescence. Okay. And others, it's just, again, they're just missing the point completely, and they're looking in only one area, and they're missing these other areas. And, again, I can't emphasize that enough.
Oren, you bring up such an important point there, and I think that that leads into what is going to be part 2 of this episode, where we discuss some real data surrounding these exact problems that you've mentioned. So to our listeners, let us know your thoughts about our analysis of adolescence. Have you watched the show? I encourage you to take a look at it, but do so with a critical eye.
Right. And just one last thing, speaking of critical eye, it just came out. It's all over all over X, where this, I think it was a politician, was on a BBC show, and they were saying, "You haven't watched Adolescence," and they were treating it like it was a documentary. I think they actually used the word documentary.
Oh
So there's
dear.
so much misinformation. Like, what's wrong with these people? Okay. And they were chastising her for not having watched it. Right. So there are a lot of flaws. And we didn't even talk about so many other types. We were just looking more at the risk factors and the protective factors. But there's so much we could have talked about, like with the interplay between the boy and the psychologist and everything. We could have gone into so much. But we're trying to get, there's only so much that we can do. All right. But I'm just saying that some people, it's ridiculous. Let's treat it for what it is. Let's not give it too much credence. Let's not deny its, let's say, value. So anyway, on that note, until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel.